So, um, when you think about getting a medical diagnosis, there's actually a certain, I don't know, a certain comfort in the machinery of it.
Oh,
Uh,
absolutely. Yeah, it's very clinical.
right, like you fall off a ladder, your arm hurts, and the doctor takes an x-ray. You look at the film and you see this jagged white line straight through the bone.
Right. And the doctor just points right to it and says, there is the fracture,
Exactly. It's undeniable. It's right there in black and white. You have visual proof of the pain.
which removes all the guesswork. I mean, that's inherently soothing because the problem is localized, it's defined.
But, the moment you step into the world of human psychology or family dysfunction or childhood trauma,
That x-ray machine just disappears.
it totally disappears.
Yeah.
We rely on symptoms, right? Just like echoes of the damage. You can't just take a scan of a betrayed childhood, slide it onto a light box, and point to the fracture.
No, because it's entirely invisible to the naked eye. I mean, the physical evidence of a psychological wound, it simply does not exist in a way that you can just, place it on a table and examine it.
Which really brings us to the mission of our deep dive today. What if someone actually found a way to take all that invisible, complex family baggage, which, let's be honest, so many of you listening right now probably carry in some form, and turn it into something physical?
Something you can actually see, touch, or even, stand underneath.
Right. Today we are exploring the life and the monumental impact of the French-American artist Louise Bourgeois. And we are drawing exclusively from a really comprehensive biographical source today, her Wikipedia article, to basically trace a career trajectory that defies, well, pretty much every conventional rule of the art world.
It really is a remarkable source to unpack. I mean, it takes us all the way from her early life in France through, honestly, decades of relative obscurity to this massive explosion of global fame that didn't truly happen until she was in her 70s.
It's just wild to think about.
Right. And we're looking at her evolution, the specific mechanics of her major works, and also the highly polarized critiques of her legacy that are still around today.
Because, a lot of us try to manage our childhood issues through therapy, or maybe we just throw ourselves into our careers.
Yeah.
But Louise Bourgeois channeled her trauma into a 30-foot-tall bronze spider.
As one does.
Right, as one does. So this deep dive is really about that alchemy, taking vulnerability and fear and turning it into undeniable physical power. But to understand the art, we have to understand the environment she was trying to escape. Her story begins in France, at a pretty unique childhood home, right?
Yeah, so Bourgeois was born in Paris in 1911, but early on, her family moved to Choisy-le-Roi, where her parents ran this antique tapestry restoration workshop. And right away, we see this foundational dynamic taking shape.
Oh, with her job in the shop.
Exactly. As a child, Louise was put to work in the family business. Her specific job was to literally sketch the missing, worn-out sections of these damaged tapestries so that the weavers could repair them.
Wow. So her earliest introduction to, draftsmanship is actively observing where the fabric of something has rotted away and then drawing a bridge across that gap.
It's incredibly poetic.
It is. It's this powerful metaphor for what she would basically spend the rest of her life doing. But looking through the biography, it seems like the most significant rot wasn't actually in the tapestries downstairs.
No, it was definitely the family dynamic happening upstairs. The environment was just profoundly fractured. Her father was overtly unfaithful, frequently bringing mistresses into the family home.
Which is awful on its own, but
But the definitive trauma of her youth was this decade-long affair her father had with a woman named Sadie Gordon Richmond.
and the structural deception of that affair is really what stands out in the source. Because Sadie wasn't just, a passing acquaintance. She was Louise's English tutor.
Right, and she was only 6 years older than Louise.
Yeah, really? Only 6 years.
Yeah, and she lived in the house with them. So young Louise is sitting at the dinner table, fully aware of this massive deception, just watching her father flaunt his infidelity. Bourgeois later described her father as the wolf, and her mother, who was chronically ill and, chose to tolerate the affair, as the rational hare.
Wow. Living in a house where the reality everyone acknowledges is just entirely different from the truth happening right in front of your eyes, that has to create some intense cognitive dissonance. The child is just trapped in this web of shifting loyalties.
Exactly. So, seeking a way to cope with all that instability, Bourgeois actually entered the Sorbonne in 1930. But interestingly, she didn't enroll to study art. She enrolled to study mathematics and geometry.
Which on the surface seems like a complete pivot away from the creative world she grew up in, like tapestries to geometry.
Right, it seems random.
But looking at her own reasoning provided in the source, it makes perfect psychological sense. She said she sought peace of mind only through the study of rules nobody could change.
Yes, when the rules of human behavior in your home are constantly being rewritten by this dominant patriarch, you look for an anchor. Mathematics offered a really rigid, predictable structure.
A geometric proof does not lie.
Exactly. The wolf cannot manipulate an equation, so it provided this desperately needed psychological baseline for her.
But an anchor only works if the chain holds, right?
Yeah.
And in 1932, while she's immersed in this world of predictable rules, her mother passed away.
And suddenly, mathematics completely failed her.
Right, because geometry cannot calculate the weight of profound grief. And a mathematical proof cannot punish the father that she blamed for her mother's suffering. So when her mother died, why did she abandon that life raft and jump into the chaotic ocean of art?
Because the rules just didn't offer comfort anymore. Art became the only space equipped to handle the sheer irrationality of human emotion. And honestly, her entry into the formal art world was highly pragmatic.
Pragmatic how?
Well, she joined these art classes where English-speaking students were enrolled because there was a loophole. If you provided translation for the English speakers, you didn't have to pay tuition.
Oh, that's brilliant. It's such a practical maneuver. She just circumvents the financial barrier entirely.
Totally. And it was in one of those classes that the Cubist painter, Fernand Léger, observed her work and essentially diagnosed her true medium. He told her she wasn't a painter, she was a sculptor.
And that observation just fundamentally shifted her trajectory, right? Because if her goal was to make the invisible weight of her childhood physical, she needed a three-dimensional medium. She needed mass and gravity.
Exactly. She actually later referred to her art as an exorcism, a method of survival. But the critical thing to understand here is that this exorcism did not yield immediate acclaim, not even close.
Far from it. I mean, looking at the timeline of her career, it is a massive departure from that standard narrative of a young, breakout genius. She moved to New York in 1938 with her husband, the American art professor Robert Goldwater, and she spent decades just struggling to gain a foothold in the New York art scene.
Yeah, if you look at her work from the early 1940s, she was out scavenging junkyard scraps and pieces of driftwood to create these upright wooden figures.
Like the piece mentioned in the source, sleeping figure.
Right. She was using the inherent flaws in the scavenged wood to express vulnerability. She would literally drive nails into the wood to invent holes and scratches, physically scarring the material to mimic emotional weathering. It depicted a figure unable to face the real world due to its own fragility.
And she characterized her artistic evolution during this whole mid-century period as moving through three distinct psychological phases. First, the fear of falling, which then transitioned into the art of falling, and finally arriving at the art of hanging in there.
And that phrase, the art of hanging in there, that perfectly encapsulates her position in the art world for decades. She was this peripheral figure, respected by peers, sure, but lacking any mainstream institutional backing.
Until basically the end of her life.
Right. The watershed moment did not arrive until 1982, when the Museum of Modern Art gave her a retrospective, and she was 70 years old.
Isn't it staggering that she waited until she was 70 years old to reveal the true why behind her entire life's work? I mean, she spends her entire adult life meticulously constructing these psychological monuments. But it was only during that MoMA show that she finally disclosed that the imagery was fiercely autobiographical.
Right, rooted directly in the trauma of her father and the governess.
Yeah. Why hold that back for half a century?
Well, up until that point, the dominant trend in the mid-century art world was abstract expressionism and minimalism. Those are movements that often, distance the creator's personal biography from the final object.
Oh.
But by the 1980s, the cultural appetite had really shifted toward the personal and the psychological, so the dam broke, and she finally gave the public the cipher to decode her entire catalog.
And once that cipher is out, you'll look back at her prior work, and the violence of it just comes into this sharp, terrifying focus.
Yeah.
Like, let's look at the massive installation she created a few years prior to that retrospective in 1974, titled Destruction of the Father.
Oh, this piece. This is the ultimate confrontation of her childhood trauma. It's a room-sized installation, and it's bathed in this harsh, theatrical red light. She constructed this womb-like environment using materials like plaster, latex, wood, and fabric.
And the mechanics of those materials are really crucial here. She's taking a brutal, violent concept, but executing it with soft, fleshy, tactile materials like latex and fabric. It creates this profound unease.
It really does.
Because you're looking at a stylized dining room, and setting it in a dining room, that is such a deliberate choice. For anyone who grew up in a tense household, you know the dining room table is the ultimate theater of forced compliance.
Oh, absolutely.
It's where everyone has to sit, eat, and perform normalcy, regardless of whatever dysfunction is happening behind closed doors.
Yeah, and Bourgeois herself described the specific dynamics she was targeting here. The father sitting at his table, boasting day after day, just demanding the attention of his captive audience.
And the installation depicts the breaking point of that dynamic, right?
Exactly. It's the abstract, kind of blob-like children. In the piece, they rebel. They grab the domineering father, lay him out on the dining table, dissect him, dismember him, cut off his penis, and consume him.
Wow. She is taking the psychological consumption of her childhood, like the way her father's ego just devoured the family's peace, and she's reversing it into a physical, cannibalistic revenge. It's that invisible fracture made aggressively visible.
Right. She stated that the father was liquidated the same way he liquidated the children. It's a massive exploration of dominance and retaliation. And, as she was creating these intensely personal exorcisms, the cultural landscape around her was changing. By the 1970s, the rising feminist movement began looking very closely at her work.
Well, yeah, because when you put art into the public sphere, you can't really control how the public uses it.
Right.
Like being drafted into an army you didn't sign up for.
Exactly.
For example, she had this series of paintings from 1946 and 1947 called Femme Maison, which translates to Woman House. And these pieces depicted women whose heads and torsos were replaced by architectural structures, houses, effectively erasing their individual identities and confining their minds entirely to the domestic sphere.
And the visual vocabulary of Femme Maison resonated deeply with second-wave feminism. In 1976, that image was placed on the cover of a major book of feminist essays by Lucy Lippard. So almost overnight, the movement adopted Bourgeois, elevating her to the status of a feminist icon.
Which introduces a really complex tension. I mean, if an artist creates a piece purely to process their own individual, highly specific pain, like the trauma of Sadie in the tapestry shop, does a broader political movement really have the right to repurpose that art as a mascot for a collective struggle?
Bourgeois actually wrestled with that very question. According to the source, she claimed her work was pre-gender. She argued that core human emotions like jealousy, fear, and betrayal, they are neither exclusively male nor female. She explicitly stated, "There is no feminine experience in art, at least not in my case."
But she also didn't totally barricade herself from the movement, did she?
No, she didn't. She recognized the structural inequalities in the industry. She was highly disillusioned by the concept of patriarchal genius that kind of governed the museum ecosystem, so she did ally with activists when their goals aligned.
Right.
In the 1970s, she joined the Fight Censorship Group, which was a collective defending the use of explicit sexual imagery in art. The group's founder, Anita Steckel, articulated their stance with a pretty sharp critique. She said, "If the erect penis is not wholesome enough to go into museums, it should not be considered wholesome enough to go into women."
Wow. It is fascinating how her work acts as this cultural Rorschach test. You have the 70s feminist movement holding her up as this vanguard of liberation. But then, as her fame compounded, so did the scrutiny. Looking at the conflicting views in our source material, you see that not everyone views her catalog as a masterclass in confronting trauma.
Oh, the criticism could be incredibly fierce. The biography cites a 2024 review in The Australian by art critic Christopher Allen. He actually dismissed Bourgeois as chronically overrated.
Right, I read his critique. And his premise seems to be less about her specific sculptures and more about the art market's machinery. He basically argued that the art world desperately wanted to manufacture a modern master, and that the compelling tragedy of her backstory was used to overshadow what he saw as actual technical weaknesses.
Yeah, Allen argued that her perceived inadequacies were intentionally ignored by an institutional demand for a certain type of historical figure. And just to be clear to the listener, our goal here isn't to declare a winner between the feminist adulation and Allen's harsh dismissal. We're just reporting what's in the source.
Exactly. We're not taking sides here at all. But it does underscore how Bourgeois' work, once it was removed from her own mind, became a vessel for whatever the culture needed to see, whether that was political defiance or, as Allen claims, institutional overreach.
Definitely.
So she spent decades dissecting the trauma of the father figure, dismantling the patriarchy of her own household. But the defining pivot of her entire legacy, the work that cemented her in the global consciousness, came when she finally turned her attention to the ultimate source of protection in her life, her mother.
Yes. In the late 1990s, when Bourgeois was well into her 80s, she introduced the motif that would define her, the spider.
Right.
Specifically, the piece titled Maman, which is a monumental structure made of steel, marble, and bronze that stands over 9 meters, so nearly 30 feet tall.
Okay, look, as someone who will actively cross the street to avoid a spider web, I really struggle with this. We have this primal evolutionary fear of arachnids. We are biologically wired to perceive them as threats. How does taking a terrifying creature and blowing it up to the size of a 3-story building change that fear into comfort? What is the mechanism there?
It is entirely about scale and perspective. If you look down at a small spider on the floor, your instinct might be to crush it, right? Because it's an unpredictable pest.
Definitely.
But when you make a spider 30 feet tall, you can no longer look down on it. You have to stand underneath it. The massive legs act as architectural pillars. It completely ceases to be a pest, and it becomes a canopy, a shelter.
Oh, wow. So it shifts from a threat to a protective enclosure.
Precisely. And Bourgeois explicitly connected the spider to her mother, who, remember, managed the tapestry restoration. She was a weaver.
Oh, of course.
Right. Bourgeois pointed out that spiders are clever, helpful presences that consume disease-spreading mosquitoes. By forcing the viewer into the physical space beneath this massive, grounded structure, she actually alters your somatic response to the maternal figure. It's looming, yes, but it is guarding you.
That is brilliant how she subverts that phobia. I mean, it literally earned her the nickname Spider Woman. And to truly understand the protective weight of Maman, you really have to look at how she utilized the exact opposite mechanism in another series of sculptures called maisons fragiles, or empty houses.
The contrast there is essential. The maisons fragiles are these tall, exceedingly narrow metallic structures that lack any substantial base or foundation. They just hold a tray at the top. When you stand near them, they don't offer shelter at all. They provoke a visceral sense of instability.
They induce vertigo. And the source actually notes a fascinating psychological detail here. Child psychologists have found that highly anxious children, when they are asked to draw a house, will often draw tall, narrow structures without a baseline. They instinctively omit the foundation.
Because they lack a foundation in their own lives. Even in her later years, Bourgeois was still employing the exact psychological geometry of a traumatized child. She knew exactly how to manipulate the physical environment to recreate the instability she felt in Choisy-le-Roi.
And the art market responded to that mastery in completely unprecedented ways. I mean, her bronze spider works shattered records. In 2011, one sold for $10.7 million, which set an auction record for a woman artist at the time.
And then a few years later, in 2015, another spider sold for $28.2 million.
It's unbelievable.
She achieved historical market dominance, but I think more importantly, she never stopped working. She continued creating new pieces right up until the week before she died of heart failure in 2010. She was 98 years old.
98. Which really brings us to the ultimate takeaway from the trajectory of Louise Bourgeois. It's this profound rejection of the idea that life or relevance has an expiration date.
Oh, absolutely.
She labored in obscurity through her middle age. She didn't receive her MoMA retrospective until she was 70. She conceptualized her most iconic 30-foot masterpiece in her late 80s. She basically proves that relentlessly confronting your darkest memories can eventually yield your greatest triumphs.
She refused to hide the mess, and in doing so, she constructed a legacy that outlived the people who caused her pain.
Exactly. But I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to consider today. The biography details a series of works she created late in life called The Cells. These were enclosed architectural installations, essentially small rooms filled with highly symbolic, deeply personal items from her past. And Bourgeois herself actually noted that while each cell dealt with a specific fear, they also dealt with the pleasure of the voyeur, the thrill of looking and being looked at.
It is a really profound admission. She took the intensely private betrayals of her childhood, the humiliation of the dinner table, the grief of her mother's death, and she systematically housed them in major museums for millions of strangers to scrutinize.
Which completely reorients how we view the artist's power, right? By turning her deepest personal trauma into these massive, globally consumed spectacles, did Louise Bourgeois ultimately conquer her childhood pain? Or did she simply invite you to step inside her childhood home, locking you into the role of a permanent voyeur to her suffering? At the start of this deep dive, we talked about how a clean medical X-ray offers a neat, objective picture of a broken bone.
Yeah, and Bourgeois definitely did not give us a clean X-ray.
No, she didn't. She waded into the murky, irrational depths of human emotion, scooped up the anxiety and the betrayal, and sculpted them into monuments. She forces you to look closely at the fracture. And maybe, just maybe, by making us stare at her mess, she makes us feel a little more secure in our own.